All right, today we're going to be talking about trauma, emotional impairment, and language for educators. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I wrote my master's thesis on this, so I spent a lot of time thinking about traumatized children and understanding how trauma impacts your brain and your language has really changed the way I approach children, and I hope it does the same for you guys. So today we're going to define what these two things are, identify causes and effects of trauma, talk about how it impacts language skills, and talk about how to make your classroom better, and kind of connect trauma to emotional impairments and talk about some more things along those lines too. So I just want to shout out, I went to Western Michigan University, go Broncos, and they have the Resiliency Center, which is where I was trained. It's where I did a lot of my research. And it's where everything I've kind of learned about this topic is that. And Dr. Suarez and Dr. Heider. Dr. Heider was my thesis mentor, and she's an amazing lady. And I owe her so much. So please check out their website. They have tons of resources. And if you know someone who has been a victim of trauma or has been in the foster care system, anything like that, this is a really great website for you to use. And I would highly recommend sending children to this program. So let's talk about language and trauma. When I say trauma, I really want to kind of define our terms here. More specifically talking about complex trauma, which is exposure to one or more traumatic events like war, family death, abuse, neglect, all those good things. And it's the lasting impact of experiencing these events. So it's not just the fact that you saw something terrible, it's the fact that you have had impacts from experiencing this. And all this together is why we call it complex trauma. Complex trauma can be caused by a lot of different things. There's direct trauma exposure, which is abuse. You see these three kinds of different types of abuse. And abuse kind of technically defined is when an adult does something to hurt a child. So it can be physical, that's sadly beating up on a kid, emotional, doing things that are really actively hurting a child's sense of self and emotional well-being, and then sexual abuse, which I think we all know pretty well, sadly. Then we have neglect. That is when a lack of action harms a child. So, for example, medical neglect is, let's say you have a child with a pretty significant medical condition, like a child breaks their arms and nobody takes them to the doctor. That's an example of medical neglect. Educational neglect, one very relevant to us, that's like not taking kids to school, not giving them a proper education. And then physical neglect is not giving kids food, water, shelter, the basic things they need to live. Emotional neglect can be hard to describe and hard to define, but when we talk about this is not giving children the things that they emotionally need to be healthy. And then we also have indirect trauma exposure. So witnessing violence is kind of the most popular one. Children who are victims of war and crime, that is a type of indirect trauma exposure. Medical trauma. So children who have cancer are a really popular thing. You know, their sense of safety and well-being are really impacted by that experience of having that big medical condition. Apparent death is also, it's kind of in between direct and indirect trauma because it directly happens to you, but it's not something that someone did to you. And here are some other types of indirect trauma. So kids in the foster care system tend to have this a lot. So if you experience impaired parenting where your parent was maybe high or drunk or not able to take care of you in the right way, if you frequently move around and you don't get a chance to really come up with deep bonds with other important people, you move around and you're taken outside of your home and placed into a different place, that's indirect trauma, because maybe that's not exactly the trauma. Maybe that's not the reason you were taken out of the home, but you're still leaving people you know, leaving people you love, you're not going to feel as safe, and that's very harmful and very sad for children. There are many signs of trauma that will kind of let you know that someone has experienced it. And I just want to say, you'll never know 100% whether someone has experienced trauma unless someone has like told you that. These are just signs that can maybe indicate that someone has experienced trauma. And some of these signs of trauma are also signs of other types of mental disability. So it's important not to say, oh, you're doing this, that means you've 100% experienced trauma. But it's also really important to keep your mind open to the thought that someone's experiencing that. Maybe they don't just have a mental disorder, maybe they've also experienced trauma. So that's kind of two things to hold in your head at once, but it's a really important thing to hold in your head. So there are some behavioral signs of trauma. Kind of the big thing is very explosive behavior. This is kind of a famous one. I've heard it described as going from 0 to 100. You see a kid who's really calm, and all of a sudden, one little thing that maybe you as an adult don't even pick up on happens, and they are losing it. They're screaming, they're yelling, they're attacking people, they're, going crazy. They can be really aggressive towards themselves or other people, cutting, hitting, all that stuff. When they play, sometimes children will pretend to like act out violence on their dolls, or even really sad, they will also sometimes when they're playing have like sexual behavior when they're playing, like act out what happened to them, which is really sad. Sometimes they can be very, very shy or withdrawn. That's what that is supposed to say, and it's going to drive me crazy. So we're going to edit that live during the video. There we go. Sometimes they can be really, really bossy and demanding towards adults. So they'll try to get you to do like a million things. Do this, do that. They will act maybe sexually in a way that's not typical for their behavior. I've seen children talk about like watching pornography and they're 5 years old, which is really, that's really terrible. And then difficulty sleeping, eating, or toileting are all signs that you could have experienced trauma. Big mood. So now let's talk about mood. You can have mood swings, again, that quick and explosive anger, and then depression is also a sign of trauma. And they also will have issues with attachment. And when we say attachment, that's forming relationships with other people in your life. So sometimes they'll be really, really friendly with strangers and act like you're their best friend, even though you've never met them before. Sometimes they could be, and they kind of can go back and forth between really, really clingy with a trusted adult and then be really, really aggressive. Sometimes an adult who knows them and loves them will try to be affectionate towards them, and they will kind of be like, no way, I'm not going to return that. And when they get hurt or if they're afraid emotionally, they often don't have this idea that, oh, I could go to an adult and they will help me. So they won't go to adults for that, which is really sad. So the reason that we talk about trauma, and I gave you all those signs of trauma on this lesson where we're talking about emotional impairment, because as you can see, a lot of those signs of trauma map on to the Mars definition of emotional impairment. So if we think about, I just talked about how you have difficulty building relationships with other people and adults. If we look at criteria A, it's inability to maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships within the school environment. That's pretty, to me, that maps on really directly. And you can see how a lot of children with trauma might get an emotional impairment label. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings, a general mood of unhappiness or depression, that maps on. And physical symptoms of fears associated with personal or school problems. So I'm not saying that every child with an emotional impairment has experienced trauma, but I also think it's really important to consider that many children with emotional impairments probably have experienced emotional impairment, or many children with school eligibilities of emotional impairment have the label of, may have experienced trauma. So we kind of talked about some of the causes of trauma, what trauma looks like, and signs that it exists. So let's talk about the impact of trauma. I think what a lot of people don't understand or know about trauma is that it is actually damaged. Trauma causes brain damage, and there's kind of no way around that. The biggest area that trauma affects is the area of your brain that's responsible for responding to stress. Because the young brain of a child who's experienced trauma is stressed out so much more than a child who hasn't, those brain structures are not the same. And that is why you sometimes get that 0 to 100. They don't have that slow release of like, oh, I'm getting stressed. Their brain is either I'm mad, I'm stressed out, everything's happening, or I'm okay. In addition to that area of the brain that's responsible for stress, brains tend to have less electrical activity. It doesn't talk to itself as well after experiencing trauma. Certain other brain structures, like your frontal lobe, that executive functioning region, are actually smaller in people who've experienced trauma. And in addition, because if you think about it, when you feel stress, you know that there are physical differences in your body. Your heart rate goes up. Your digestion is affected by that. All those things, because children who have experienced trauma are under this constant state of stress, and the area of their brain that responds to stress doesn't work normally anymore. Children with trauma exposure have a lot of heart problems. I remember when I was a student and I worked at the trauma assessment center, I had a child that I was working with, and they were so calm. You never would have guessed it. They were like 8 or 10 years old, and they had a resting heart rate that was 150 beats, which is crazy. That's so high if you think it's supposed to be about 100. And people who experience trauma tend to have more heart problems, breathing problems, and shorter lifespans because of their experience with trauma. Because their brains are so affected, experiencing trauma can also really impact how you think. We talked about cognition a lot, and when we talked about intellectual disabilities, so some of those cognitive skills are really affected by trauma too. So generally speaking, their overall IQ score is lower, but it's not lower by a lot. It's only about 10 points. So a lot of these kids are still within the normal range, but they're on that lower end of the normal range. There is some mixed evidence for memory problems in people with trauma, but it's kind of inclusive. Some studies say absolutely there's tons of problems with memory, and some say no evidence for that. So we'll need some more research to really get some good data about that. The biggest thing that most studies will show is that people who've experienced trauma have big problems with executive functioning, working memory, and attention. So those problem solving, self-regulation, ability to hold information in your head so you can use it, and focus are really, really affected by experiencing trauma. And in addition, a lot of people who have experienced trauma have big problems with social cognition. So this is the understanding of social relationships. So they have big problems recognizing emotions. They have problems with theory of mind and matching emotions to different facial expressions. And what was really sad and kind of interesting about these studies is we found that children who experienced trauma were much better at recognizing negative emotions. Like if they saw an angry face, they could very clearly say, yeah, that person's angry. But if they saw someone like happy or laughing, they had trouble labeling what that emotion is. And so this is from Dr. Heider, the wonderful, intelligent lady who trained me and gave me a lot of this. This is her infographic, and it kind of shows how pragmatic language rests on a lot of those cognitive skills that we talked about. So obviously, you need to be able to understand other people, their emotions, what they might be thinking. You need to be able to come up with a plan. You need to be able to be flexible and move around. And then you need to have working memory to hold your plan in your head and use your social cognition to put those two into action to do pragmatic language. And when we say affective state, that means how you're feeling inside. So that if you're in a calm and regulated affective state and you're feeling good, you're in the green zone if we're talking about zones of regulation, you are much better at coming up with a plan and using your executive functioning skills. If you are in red or yellow zone, you're not going to be able to come up with plans and use that effective or executive functioning as well as you would normally. And for our children who've experienced trauma, because of how their brain works and that stress response, and because having depression and mood disorders are often a part of experiencing trauma, it can be very hard to be in a calm, affective state so they can use their executive functioning. All right, and now kind of what we're here for, right? The linguistic impact of trauma. So kind of like IQ, they have overall lower grammar and vocabulary skills. But really, honestly, these aren't so much lower, but significantly so to where they're about 10 points behind. So a lot of them are still in that normal range, but not, but still much lower than children who haven't experienced trauma. One of the biggest things that we found a lot of evidence for is difficulty with those pragmatic language skills. So they have difficulty using language for debating and arguing with people and staying on topic. They have difficulty telling stories. That's a really big one. And sadly, that's a really important one for children who've experienced trauma. A lot of these kids will have to kind of explain their situation and their story to the court, to other people, to in a lot of different situations, and not being able to tell stories with the right amount of information in an organized way can really affect them a lot. And in addition, a lot of the therapy we give to children, like therapy that like social workers and psychologists give to people who have experienced trauma, involves them telling a story. So being able to tell a story with good content and organization is really important for their overall healing too. So really important language skill that is hard for them. And then it's also a really sad but really important fact to keep in mind that students who have experienced trauma are much more likely to go to jail and interact with a court, and they are much less likely to succeed in school. So that's something to really keep in your heart too, because your work with these kids who've experienced trauma can really help them succeed in school and therefore keep them from being incarcerated. Because we know that the better you tend to do at school, the less likely you're going to tend to experience jail. So now let's talk about overall emotional impairment outside of the scope of trauma. So here are some of the causes of emotional impairment. Of course, experiencing trauma is one of them, just like we talked. It can cause a lot of those things from our MARS criteria. Oppositional defiant disorder. This is a disability that can be very hard for teachers because it's basically children who refuse to go with the flow. Personality disorders. The most famous one of these is narcissistic personality disorder, where you kind of think you're the center of the universe. But there's other types. There are some where people are very dramatic and they can't recognize that their problems are not world-ending problems. There are some called borderline personality disorder, which kind of has a pattern of like risk-taking behavior. Lots of different kinds. It's kind of outside of the scope of our class today to go into each one of them. But if you're curious, you can look on the Mayo Clinic and they have a nice breakdown of what personality disorders are. There's mood disorders that can also cause emotional impairments. So there's anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and then schizophrenia is another one. So that's very famously seeing voices, kind of the paranoid bit, all of those things. So And there's other causes too, but these are kind of the most common ones and ones to look out for. And so emotional impairments and children who have experienced trauma can either kind of have more internalizing behaviors or externalizing. So internalizing are things that are directed towards yourself. So anxiety and depression are a good example. Externalizing disorders, so aggression, ODD, all of those things are negative behaviors and emotions that are directed outwards towards other people and situations. Boys tend to have more externalizing disorders. We've just kind of, that's a weird thing we've socialized people for. But it's also very important to remember that there's kind of culturally, it can be kind of biased because sometimes we see externalizing disorders in boys more, and we miss internalizing disorders in boys more. And the same thing can be true for girls. We may miss an externalizing disorder because we think of girls as like, oh, they're very, they collapse in, they're delicate, they don't do that. So always important to keep that in mind too. So we also know that many, many children with emotional disorders have language problems too. So disruptive behavior disorders were all linked with expressive, receptive, and pragmatic impairments. We also know that anxiety and depression tend to have a correlation with language impairments. And then generally speaking, kids with any kind of emotional impairment tend to have more problems with expressive than receptive, but, obviously it depends on the kid. And then schizophrenia has a really unique language profile. It can be really disorganized. It tends to have a lot of made up words, and the pragmatic impairments are really, really obvious in schizophrenia. They have an especially hard time with some of those figurative language. So we talked about that a little bit in our language development class where, they have trouble understanding that you're as big as a house means that you're fat. It doesn't mean that you are literally as big as a house. So now let's kind of talk about what we do about it. So the reason that this doesn't say that we're talking about trauma-informed care is because this is a direct thing that you do for emotional impairments, is because trauma-informed care is a mindset, and having a trauma-informed approach will make you better at dealing with kids, even if they haven't experienced trauma and they just have an emotional impairment without trauma. So these are assumptions that you want to keep in your heart when you are trying to build a trauma-informed classroom. You want to be aware of how trauma can affect children mentally, emotionally, all of those things that we talked about on our first few slides. You want to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. So hopefully that signs and symptoms slides will help you with that. You want to use your knowledge about trauma to respond to children. So we're going to talk about some more concrete ways to do that. But it's really important to have that in your heart, is to use what we know about trauma when you're interacting with a child. And then you want to actively resist re-traumatization. Again, we're going to give some more concrete things, but we really want to make a classroom and an environment that prevents kids from experiencing more trauma and more harm or triggering a trauma response in them. And then these are the principles that trauma-informed care has for us. You want to always prioritize safety, and not just the physical safety of a child. I think that's kind of a given, but the emotional safety of a child. A lot of these children, the feeling of safety has kind of been really stolen from them. And so we want to make an environment that feels as safe as we possibly can. We want to build trustworthiness and transparency in our classroom. So kids need to feel that they can trust you and depend on you. And the way you do that is by being clear about how and why you're going to do things in your classroom. Building peer support is so important. So building relationships between students and having friends and things that they can do. You want to have children bring their own experience to the table and collaborate with you. This helps children feel in control and calm and empowered, because a lot of these children, their bodily and physical and emotional autonomy has been stolen from them. So when we're building a trauma-informed classroom, you want to give them as much ability to collaborate and work with you and advocate for what they need. And then always empowerment, voice, and choice. So you want the children to feel empowered. You want their culture and their history to be honored. And you want to give them choices throughout the day for as much as you can. And then always remember that when we're having trauma-informed care, part of feeling safe is having people's history, culture, and gender really respected. I don't think that you can build an organization with these without recognizing that someone's culture, the history that they bring, and their identity are so, so important to building a safe and healthy classroom environment. So, how do you make your classroom feel safe? And there is a fabulous resource that I'm going to put on the Canvas link. I really recommend reading it. I learned a ton from reading it. And it's kind of a guide to how to make your classroom feel safe and feel trauma informed. They recommend making a peace corner or a calming corner. So, this is an area where students can go where no matter what's going on in life and whatever they're experiencing, they can kind of just hide out there and take a break and not deal with people, no questions asked. You really want to make your classroom routines really, really predictable. So every day you do the same things in the same way. And very similar to our friends with autism, it's a really important part of it to feel like you know what's going to happen and what's going to go. Even things that you wouldn't think about, like moving around the classroom furniture, they're going to need warnings and preparation because that can be upsetting. They need as much consistency as possible. When you do change something in your classroom, which we all have to sometimes, right? You want to provide a warning and an explanation for any change that you can. Like if you move seats, you can explain. I wanted to make it feel better for you guys. There were some kids that have a hard time not talking to each other. That's why I moved your seats. And you want to warn them about it before it happens so they don't just walk in and, oh my God, my seat's been moved. Visuals are always a great thing. So, having a visual timer so they know how much time they have left to work or play. And trying to recognize triggers. And this is such a hard thing because it can be so different for each individual kid. Um, and but it takes time to learn them. For example, a student I worked with at my elementary school, I didn't realize that something really bad had happened to him when he was alone with an adult in a room. And as a speech therapist, when you test a kid, the first thing you do is take them alone in a room with just you. I didn't know this. And when I took him there, he is freaking out. He is very ODD. He is running around on the furniture. He's climbing, under things and over things and not doing anything that I want. I'm getting really frustrated because I don't know this kid's experienced trauma. This is just some kid I've been asked to test, right? But once I kind of figured out that, this was the problem and it was the going to the room with an adult by himself that was the issue, we kind of stepped back. I took him in a room with more and more people. So he wasn't alone with me. I worked with him in the hall because that was less triggering for him than just being one-on-one with an adult in a room. And that's always good. And then because you don't know what a kid has been through or anything like that, it's always good to ask permission before touching a student. I know for some of us, I'm a really touchy person. It can be really hard to do that. I always want to give a kid a hug or, a touch on the head, but you never know when a child that you worked with has been touched without their consent in an inappropriate way. And so just asking permission, getting some, time, seeing how they feel okay, is respectful. It will protect you a little bit and it will give the student that empowerment and safety that they need. And these are some more solid tips for principles 3 through 5. So you really want to start teaching children about regulation. And I know we have some fabulous educators. You guys have already talked to me about recognizing your trigger, recognizing what sets you up. You guys are fabulous. But this is a really good tip to do for all children. Showing them like, wow, when you're alone with an adult in a room, that seems to make you really upset, and teaching them how to label that, how to advocate for that, and say, Miss Shalino, I don't feel safe going into the room by myself with you. Can we do it in another place? And teaching them those advocacy skills, teaching them like what you might feel like when you're in the zones of regulation. Starting a buddy program is really nice. Giving choices throughout the day. Hey, do you want to sit on the floor or at the rug? Do you want to do math now or do you want to do reading now? All those kinds of things. Letting students have some input into the classroom rules and maybe different projects that you do. And always, always, always be transparent in how and why you do things. So when I was at the Children's Trauma Assessment Center, one of the things we had to do was I had, with another person, of course, I had to test these kids' IQ. And my instinct when I first started testing those kids was, and they asked me, why am I doing this? Was just, I don't want to say lie, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to say that this is an IQ test because I was afraid they would like change how they behave. But my partner, who was a social worker and very experienced, came up to me and said, like, no, we tell them exactly why. And then she went over to the kid and explained what an IQ test was and why we were doing it and why we needed to do it. And it made the kid a lot calmer. They performed a lot better and just everything went smoother because my testing partner did that. So always be transparent, even if you feel like, maybe this isn't a great idea or maybe you don't know. That's an important part of building trust and helping these kids develop. And then here are some tips directly to help the trauma or to help the language skills of these kids. So directly teaching story structure, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do. You want to talk about the emotional states of characters and kind of teach those emotion words directly to student in your instruction as you would other vocabulary words. You can also do what we call think out loud, why characters in your story might do the way. So a think out loud might be, you have a book open and you see, let's say, this picture of this like very angry person in the middle. I would say, oh man, I think he's angry because he's yelling. His eyes are squinty. You kind of explain why you think something's happening and you break that down to them. And then having push-in sessions with the SLP can be really, really helpful for these. So because we don't have a ton of evidence about exactly what specific areas of grammar and vocabulary are hard for these kids. The research is just kind of not out yet on that. So having good assessments and having good work with an SLP to really break down those specific areas and working with them to incorporate those in your classroom will be really, really helpful to you. All right, and these are my works cited and consulted. Please check out that guide. It'll be really helpful, and hopefully you can carry some of these strategies with you in your own practice.